The St. Patrick's Battalion, formed and led by John Riley, was a unit of 175 to several hundred immigrants and expatriates of European descent who fought as part of the Mexican Army against the United States in the Mexican-American War of 1846–8. Most of the battalion's members had deserted or defected from the United States Army. The battalion served as an artillery unit for much of the war, despite later being formally designated as 2 infantry companies. It still retained artillery pieces throughout the conflict. In many ways, the battalion acted as the sole Mexican counterbalance to the recent U.S. innovation of horse artillery. The San Patricios were responsible for the toughest battles encountered by the United States in its invasion of Mexico, with Ulysses S. Grant remarking that Churubusco proved to be about the severest battle fought in the Valley of Mexico. Composed primarily of Catholic, Irish and German immigrants, the battalion also included Canadians, English, French, Italians, Poles, Scots, Spaniards, Swiss, and Mexican people, many of whom were members of the Catholic Church. Disenfranchised Americans were in the ranks, including escaped slaves from the southern United States. Only a few members of the St. Patrick's Battalion were actual U.S. citizens. The Mexican government printed propaganda in different languages to dissuade immigrants in the U.S. Army of the cause and offered incentives to foreigners who would enlist in its army, including granting them citizenship, paying higher wages than the U.S. Army, and the offer of generous land grants. The San Patricios are revered and honored in Mexico and Ireland. Members of the battalion are known to have deserted from U.S. Army regiments including the 1st Artillery, the 2nd Artillery, the 3rd Artillery, the 4th Artillery, the 2nd Dragoons, the 2nd Infantry, the 3rd Infantry, the 4th Infantry, the 5th Infantry, the 6th Infantry, the 7th Infantry and the 8th Infantry. Historical perspective. For Americans of the generation that fought the Mexican-American War, the San Patricios were considered traitors. For Mexicans of that generation, and generations to come, the San Patricios were heroes who came to their aid in an hour of need. Successive Mexican presidents have praised the San Patricios. Vicente Fox Quesada stated that the affinities between Ireland and Mexico go back to the first years of our nation, when our country fought to preserve its national sovereignty. Then, a brave group of Irish soldiers, in a heroic gesture, decided to fight against the foreign ground invasion. A Mexican president, Ernesto Zedillo, stated, members of the St. Patrick's Battalion were executed for following their consciences. They were martyred for adhering to the highest ideals. We honored the memory. In the name of the people of Mexico, I salute today the people of Ireland and express my eternal gratitude. The great majority of these men were recent immigrants who had arrived at northeastern U.S. ports, part of the Irish diaspora then escaping the Great Irish Famine and extremely poor economic conditions in Ireland, part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland at the time. The U.S. Army often recruited Irishmen and other immigrants into military service shortly or sometimes immediately after arrival to America in coffin ships, with promises of salaries and land after the war. Numerous theories have been proposed as to the motives for desertion, including cultural alienation, mistreatment of immigrant soldiers by nativist soldiers and senior officers, brutal military discipline, and dislike of service in the U.S. military, being forced to attend Protestant church services and being unable to practice the Catholic religion freely, as well as religious ideological convictions. The incentive of higher wages and land grants starting at 320 acres offered by Mexico, and viewing the U. invasion of Mexico as unjust. It is believed primary motivations were shared religion with the Mexicans and sympathy for the Mexican cause based on similarities between the situations in Mexico and Ireland. This hypothesis is based on evidence of the number of Irish Catholics in the battalion, the letters of John Riley, and the field entries of senior officers. Another hypothesis is that the members of the St. Patrick's Battalion had been unhappy with the treatment in the U.S. Army. This was the conviction of George Balentini, an Englishman who served in the American Army. Balentini stated that while there was a portion of truth in the view commonly assigned by officers that the deserters joined the Mexican Army due to the Catholicism, I have good reason to believe, in fact in some cases I number, that harsh and unjust treatment by their officers operated far more strongly than any other consideration to produce the deplorable result. Describing how he found the punishments used for trivial offensives to be revolting and disgusting. Another theory some historians hold is that the soldiers were attracted by the incentives offered by the Mexican government: safe passage throughout Mexico for deserters, generous land grants, and the offer of potential military commissions. For poor people coming from famine conditions, economics was often an important incentive. Mexican author José Raúl Conseco noted that many Irish lived in northern Texas, and were forced to move south due to regional insecurity. Mainly Irish settlers from San Patricios, Texas had previously sided with Mexican forces against Texan rebels at the Battle of Lipantitlan in the Texan Revolution. Irish expatriates had a long tradition of serving in military forces of Catholic countries, for instance, serving with Spain and later France in groups of young men who had left Ireland during what would become known as the Flight of the Wild Geese in the 17th century. In addition, many Irish fought as soldiers in South American wars of independence. Flag. There are conflicting accounts of the design of the flag of the St. Patrick's Battalion. No flags or depictions of them are known to have survived to the present day. The only version of the flag known to have survived the war was subsequently lost as stolen from the chapel at West Point. John Riley, who left an account of the battalion, noted the flag in a letter, according to an American journalist covering the war with Mexico. Two other eyewitness accounts of the flag exist, both from American soldiers. The first describes it as the second notes only. A radically different version of the flag was described in this Mexican source. Whatever the case, in 1997 a reproduction military flag was created by the Clifton and Connemara Heritage Group. Another was created the following year for the MGM film One Man's Hero. The film was a romanticized version of the San Patricios history. A third version embodying the description of the San Luis Potosi flag was made for the Irish Society of Chicago, which hung it in Chicago's Union League Club. Some theories suggest that the St. Patrick's Battalion might have used different banners. Service as a military unit. Formation and early engagements. Present in the Mexican Army for the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma were the Legión de Extranjeros, the men who would later make up the core of the St. Patrick's Battalion. Meanwhile, deserters were abandoning General Taylor's army on the Rio Grande. Riley and a company of 48 Irishmen manned Mexican artillery at the siege of Fort Texas, which took place concurrently to the two other battles. Martin Trichler, German-Mexican and a captain at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, is attributed with convincing a large number of German soldiers to defect from the U.S. occupying forces in Puebla, Buena, Puebla. The St. Patrick's Battalion first fought as a recognized Mexican unit in the Battle of Monterrey on the 21st of September 1846, as an artillery battery. Popularly they were called Los Colorados by the Mexicans because of the ruddy, sunburnt complexions and red hair color. They were commanded by John Riley, an Irish artilleryman and veteran non-commissioned officer of the British Army, who possibly arrived in Canada in 1843 whilst serving in the British Army Regiment of Foot, is known to be inaccurate, going on to join the U.S. Army in Michigan in September 1845. He deserted in Matamoros in April 1846. Upon meeting Mexican forces he was initially given the officer rank of lieutenant by General Pedro de Ampudia. At the Battle of Monterrey, the San Patricios proved their artillery skills by causing the deaths of many American soldiers, and they are credited with defeating 2 to 3 separate assaults into the heart of the city. Among the targets were companies led by such officers as Braxton and Bragg, many of whose soldiers would end up in their own ranks later in the war. The tenacity, however, did not affect the Mexican commander's decision to capitulate and abandon the position. Following the engagement at Monterrey, the San Patricios grew in number, by some estimates reaching an enlistment of over 700 men. Forces reassembled at San Luis Potosi and they had the distinct green silk flag embroidered there. Buena Vista they then marched northward after joining a larger force commanded by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna sent from Mexico City, the Liberating Army of the North. At the Battle of Buena Vista in Coahuila on the 23rd of February, the Patricios became engaged with U.S. forces. They were assigned the 3 heaviest 18 and 24-pound cannons the Mexican army possessed, which were positioned on high ground overlooking the battlefield at the base of a hillside. They were later described as a strong Mexican battery, moved by dint of extraordinary exertions, commanded the entire plateau. They started the battle supporting Mexican infantry by firing on U.S. lines as the Mexicans advanced on them, then later decimating an artillery battery directly opposite them on the battlefield. A small number of San Patricios were dispatched with a division commanded by Manuel Lombardini with the express purpose of capturing the 4th S. cannons once the crews had been dealt with. As the division got close enough they charged the artillery battery, bayoneting whoever remained and routing the rest, leaving the attached San Patricios free to haul away 2 6-pound cannons. These cannons would later be used by Mexican forces at the Battle of Contreras. In frustration, U.S. Commander Zachary Taylor, referring to the St. Patrick's Battalion, ordered a squadron of the 1st Dragoons to take the damned battery. In this task they failed, and badly bloodied, were forced to retreat. At about 1 p.m., the San Patricios covered a Mexican retreat as a disordered mass of infantry sought refuge during a lull in the fighting. The San Patricios rode out the day in a costly artillery duel with several American batteries which killed and injured roughly 1/3 of them. General Francisco Mejia's battle report for Buena Vista described the San Patricios as worthy of the most consummate praise because the men fought with daring bravery. Several Irishmen were awarded the War Cross by the Mexican government for their conduct in that battle, and many received field promotions, reorganization and final battles. Despite their excellent performance in a number of engagements as artillery, the much reduced San Patricios were ordered to muster a larger infantry battalion in mid-1847 by personal order of Santa Anna. It was renamed the Foreign Legion of Patricios and consisted of volunteers from many European countries, commanded by Col. Francisco R. Marino, with Riley in charge of 1st Company and Santiago O'Leary heading up the 2nd. Desertion handbills were produced, specially targeting Catholic, Irish, French and German immigrants in the invading U.S. Army and stating that you must not fight against a religious people, nor should you be seen in the ranks of those who proclaim slavery of mankind as a constitutive principle. Liberty is not on the part of those who desire to be lords of the world, robbing properties and territories which do not belong to them and shedding so much blood in order to accomplish the views in open war to the principles of our holy religion. As an infantry unit, the San Patricios continued to serve with distinction, knowing that they were likely to face the death penalty if captured. The San Patricios are known to have threatened wavering Mexican troops with death by friendly fire at the Battle of Cerro Gordo if they retreated. When the San Patricios were too heavily engaged to carry out the threat, the Mexican troops broke and ran, leaving the San Patricios as they fought U.S. troops in hand-to-hand combat. The Battle of Churubusco took place about 4 months after the defeat at Cerro Gordo. Gen. Santa Anna gave a verbal order to preserve the point at all risk. The San Patricio companies initially met the attackers outside the walls of the convent at Ateta Pond, which was about 500 yards from a fortified convent. A battery of 3 to 5 heavy cannons were used from this position to hold off the American advance, along with support from Los Independencia Battalion and Los Bravos Battalion. The Americans were under the command of Col. William Hoffman. Several U.S. charges towards the bridgehead were thrown off, with the San Patricio companies serving as an example to the supporting battalions. Unlike the San Patricios, most of whom were veterans, the supporting Mexican battalions were simply militia who had been attested by battle. A lack of ammunition led the Mexican soldiers in the trenches between the bridgehead and the convent to disband. Without ammunition, they had no way to fight back. Santa Anna had ordered half of these soldiers to a different part of the battlefield. When the requested ammunition wagon finally arrived, the 9.5 dram cartridges were compatible with none but the San Patricio Company's Brown Bess muskets, and they made up only a fraction of the defending forces, further hampering Mexican efforts. A stray spark from an artillery piece firing grape shot at the oncoming U.S. troops caused the just-arrived ammunition to explode and set fire to several men, including Captain O'Leary and Gen. Elenaya. A withdrawal behind the walls of the Convento de Churubusco was called when the threat of being outflanked proved too great. The San Patricios used this battle as a chance to settle old scores with U.S. troops. The large number of officers killed in the affair was ascribed to them. As for the gratification of the revenge, they aimed at no other objects during the engagement. At some point during the fighting for the convent, 2 American officers led 15 men against a point in the Mexican defenses, and mistook San Patricio members for friendly U.S. Army troops. The San Patricios opened fire on them, killing and wounding all but one of the group. Though hopelessly outnumbered and under-equipped, the defenders repelled the attacking U.S. forces with heavy losses until their ammunition ran out and a Mexican officer raised the white flag of surrender. Officer Patrick Dalton of the San Patricios tore the white flag down, prompting Gen. Pedro Anaya to order his men to fight on, with the bare hands if necessary. American Private Valentini reported that when the Mexicans attempted to raise the white flag 2 more times, members of the San Patricios shot and killed them. After brutal close-quarters fighting with bayonets and sabers through the halls and rooms inside the convent, U.S. Army Captain James M. Smith suggested a surrender after raising his white handkerchief. Following the U.S. victory, the Americans ventilate the vocabulary of Saxon expletives not very courteously on Riley and his beautiful disciples of St. Patrick. Gen. Anayu stated in his written battle report that 35 San Patricios were killed, 85 taken prisoner, about 85 escaped with retreating Mexican forces. Some 60% of the San Patricios were killed or captured in the engagement. The survivors were reformed before the Battle of Mexico City some 2 weeks later and were stationed at Querétaro, where the Mexican government had decamped, with some 50 members serving as a bodyguard for the commander-in-chief. The battalion were caught up in the infighting and politicking of Mexico at the time, and were under the patronage of a faction that favored suing for ending of the conflict peacefully. New units were later made up of the free survivors of the Battle of Churubusco and a roughly equal number of fresh deserters from the U.S. Army. Following the war, the Mexican government insisted in a clause of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that the remaining San Patricio prisoners held by the Americans were to be left in Mexico, and Major General William Orlando Butler issued General Orders 116 on June 1, 1848, stating that the prisoners confined at the citadel, known as the San Patricio prisoners, will be immediately discharged. Rogue's March was played upon the release. The St. Patrick's Battalion continued to function as 2 infantry companies under the command of John Riley, with one unit tasked with sentry duty in Mexico City and the other was stationed in the suburbs of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The San Patricios were officially mustered out of Mexican military service in 1848. Some members were alleged to have been involved in an aborted military coup, while historians have said the group was disbanded because of Mexican budget cuts. Aftermath of Churubusco trials. The San Patricios captured by the U.S. Army were treated and punished as traitors for desertion in time of war. 72 men were immediately charged with desertion by the Army. 2 separate courts-martial were held, one at Tacubaya on the 23rd of August, and another at San Angel on the 26th of August. At neither of these trials were the men represented by lawyers, nor were transcripts made of the proceedings. This lack of formal legal advice could account for the fact that several of the men claimed that drunkenness had led them to desert, and others described how they were forced to join the Mexican army in some form or another. The majority of the San Patricios either offered no defense or their defenses were not recorded. Wealthy Mexicans came to the San Patricios' defense at the trails, and members of Mexico's first families visited them in prison. Sentences. One soldier who claimed he was forced to fight by the Mexicans after he was captured by them, and who subsequently refused to do so, was sentenced to death by firing squad instead of hanging, along with another who was found not to have officially joined the Mexican army. Most of the convicted San Patricios were sentenced to death by hanging, 30 from the Tacubaya trial and 18 from San Angel. The rationale was that they had entered Mexican military service following the declaration of war. Execution by hanging was in violation of the contemporary Articles of War, which stipulated that the penalty for desertion and/or defecting to the enemy during a time of war was death by firing squad. Regardless of the circumstances, hanging was reserved only for spies and for atrocities against civilians, neither of which activities were among the charges brought against any members of the St. Patricios Battalion. Although more than 9,000 U.S. soldiers deserted the army during the Mexican-American War, only the San Patricios were punished by hanging. Those soldiers who had left military service before the official declaration of war on Mexico were sentenced to executions. In all, 50 St. Patrick's Battalion members were officially executed by the U. Army. Collectively, this was the largest mass execution in United States history. The hanging of 38 Sioux at the conclusion of the Dakota War of 1862 appears to be the largest execution by hanging at a single event. En-masse executions for treason took place at 3 separate locations on 3 separate dates. 16 were executed on the 10th of September 1847 at San Angel. 4 were executed the following day at the village of Mixcoac on the 11th of September, and 30 were hanged at Chapultepec on the 13th of September. A sole San Patricio was murdered by American soldiers when he was recognized among the prisoners of war in the aftermath of the Battle of Molino del Rey, by being thrown into a mill flume and crushed by the wheel. At the San Angel hangings, all prisoners were executed without incident except for Patrick Dalton, who, as an American captain described, was literally choked to death. Dalton had previously voiced concerns regarding his treatment. By order of Gen. Winfield Scott, 30 San Patricios were to be executed at Chapultepec in full view of the two armies while they fought the Battle of Chapultepec, at the precise moment that the flag of the U.S. replaced the flag of Mexico atop the citadel. This order was carried out by Col. William Harney. Harney was taunted and jeered by the condemned men. While overseeing the hangings, Harney ordered Francis O'Connor hanged even though he had had both legs amputated the previous day. When the army surgeon informed the colonel that the absent soldier had lost both his legs in battle, Harney replied, "The U.S. flag appeared on the flagpole at 9:30 a.m. The Mexican flag had been taken by Cadet Juan Escutia of the Niños Héroes to his death after leaping with it from Chapultepec Castle to deny the Americans the honor of capturing it. In a final act of defiance, the men about to be hanged cheered the Mexican flag. As one onlooker remarked, hands tied, feet tied. The voice is still free." At Harney's signal, the carts holding the tied and noosed men pulled away. Harney refused to cut the bodies down, stating that "I was ordered to have them hanged, and have no orders to unhang them." Harney was subsequently promoted to Brigadier General, a post which he held while the U.S. Army occupied Mexico City. The Mexican government described the hangings as a cruel death, a horrible torment, improper in a civilized age, and for a people who aspire to the title of illustrious and humane, and by a writer covering the war as the refinement of cruelty and fiendish. George Balentini remarked in his account of his American military service in Mexico that the desertion of our soldiers to the Mexican army were still numerous, in spite of the fearful example of the executions at Churubusco, also served to inspire that party with hope.